Content warning. Discussions of violence, torture and death that some people may find disturbing. Welcome to the Newcastle Witches Podcast. Thank you for listening. This is an original podcast created by Candle and Bell.
This episode is dedicated to Eleanor Rogerson.
This is episode 5, our Halloween special, the Wallsend Witches. Today we are joined by Sylvia, who runs the Haunted Palace blog with Alana. So today we are going to be talking about the Wallsend Witches.
Fantastic. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to the podcast.
Thank you for coming.
For anyone who's not familiar with the Wallsend Witches tale, I'd like to start by telling the story. So, the Wallsend Witches. Upon a time, one of the lords of Seaton Delaval was returning home from Newcastle after nightfall, and his way lying near the old chapel, now in ruins on an eminence near Wallsend, he was surprised to observe the interior of the edifice brilliantly lighted. Riding forward with the undaunted recklessness which in those days characterised many of the border families, he left his horse in charge of his servant at the gate of the burying ground which surrounded the chapel, and proceeded forward to gratify his curiosity. Upon a table, at each corner of which was placed an inverted human skull containing some inflammable substance that burned brightly, lay the body of a female, uncoffined and partly unrolled from the winding cloth. Around it, occupied in the preparation of charms, sat a number of withered hags, one of whom was at that instant employed with a short knife in cutting the left breast from the corpse. The uncouth visages of those who formed the company, considering the purpose for which they were assembled, might well have appalled a stout heart, and we cannot say that when Delaval looked upon them, his blood circulated through his veins with its wonted regularity. He stood, however, still for a time, and could observe the thin grey beards of several of the party as they turned occasionally their sunken eyes to the skulls which were flaming before them. He also perceived that when the beldam who operated as dissector had severed from the body the left breast already mentioned, it was delivered to an attendant who removed it beyond the range of his view in the direction of the belfry. Delaval now applied his strength to the door at which he stood, burst it open, and entered into the sudden dismay and consternation of the assembly, each of whom endeavoured to provide for their safety by flight. He rushed upon her, in whose hand the knife still gleamed, wrenched it from her, and his attempt to secure her, in defiance of her curses, was at last successful. Some of the company escaped by the way through which he entered, others ascended to the roof and took their departure through the openings in the belfry. These spaces also served to convey away the smoke from a fire which the workers of iniquity had kindled on the floor, and above it a cauldron or kettle was suspended from a beam by the rope with which the sexton usually rang the bell. The fire was fed with broken pieces of coffins. The breast which was cut from the body of the female, with other filthy ingredients, were boiling in the kettle over which fat and froth descended with a fizzing noise, sometimes allaying and again invigorating the flame. When Delaval had witnessed all the unhallowed objects, he hastened off with his captive and bound her on horseback behind his servant. He kept her securely until she was tried for the crime, and whether this was accomplished by virtue of his own authority or that of a jury, we cannot now decide. She was, however, sentenced to be burnt on the seashore in the vicinity of Seaton Delaval. When the order was about to be carried into execution, she requested to have the use of 2 new wooden dishes, which were forthwith procured from a neighbouring village. The wood and combustibles were heaped on the sands, the culprit was placed thereon, the dishes were given to her, and fire was applied to the pile. As the smoke arose in dense columns around her, she placed a foot in each of the utensils, muttered a spell, and cleared herself from the fastenings at the stake, and soared away on the sea breeze like an eagle escaped from the hands of its captors. When she arose to a considerable height, one of the dishes which supported her lost its efficacy from having been, by the young person who procured them, dipped unthinkingly amongst water, and after making several gyrations, the deluded follower of Satan fell to the ground. Without affording her another chance of escape, the beholders conveyed her back to the pile, and she perished amidst its flames. And that is the tale of the Wallsend Witch. Well, that particular version, it's from the local historian's table book by M.A. Richardson, so it's published around 1847. There's another version that's available online in the Monthly Chronicle of North Country Lore and Legend, and that's from April 1888. The later version is pretty much the same, but it omits a few of like the Gothic elements that Richardson has. Richardson does emphasise that breast quite a lot. The later version less so. And the later version also has a really stereotypical description of a witch, somebody with a stubbly beard, ugly buck teeth, red fiery eyes and withered, wrinkled skin. So it's all very much a storybook witch based on that. So I was curious. I thought, well, that both of those are 19th century books collecting local lore, so it's obviously a tale that's been around for a while. Richardson didn't really give a specific source for his story. He just claimed that it had been told in many ways before he wrote it down. And the Monthly Chronicle cited the most famous fan of that story, the person who told it the most, was Sir Francis Blake Delaval. And he lived between 1727 and 1771. And even in his day, both sources are agreeing it's an older tale. It's an oral folk tradition. So it's been around early in the 18th century. So the Delavals are a really fascinating family. They lived at Seaton Delaval Hall in Northumberland by the coast. And they kind of tended to attract really tall tales. There were lots of eccentrics. There's lots of ghost stories associated with the hall. Sir Francis Blake Delaval was a really keen gambler and not always successful, but he did accept a wager that he wouldn't be able to build a castle in a day. And quite amazingly, he did win that bet. And you can still see that castle. It's Starlight Castle. Its ruins are in Holywell Dean.
All right, okay.
I've been there. It's really atmospheric. It's a little bit hard to find, and there's mainly just an archway left. I mean, the chances are he cheated slightly, that he already was preparing to build something so that the building blocks were there. But it's still a great story that, this is the kind of people the Delavals were.
Yeah.
If anyone is curious about the Delaval family, you can actually go to Seaton Delaval Hall.
National Trust, I think.
Yep, it's a National Trust site, and you can go into the building. It's massive. And of course, there are so many tales about this family who just used to get up to all sorts and prank people and be very cheeky.
I think he's embellished it quite a lot.
Yeah.
And one of the things with Sir Francis was that he was also a member of Samuel Foote's theatrical troupe. Samuel Foote was a fabulous 18th century comedian and managing directed theatre productions. He also only had one leg, so being called Foote was quite ironic. Sir Francis was a comedian, and he was really theatrical, and I can just imagine him making up this, he's got this story, maybe he's heard it growing up, and he's telling this story to his theatrical friends, his kind of upper class friends, and he's embellishing it, I think he's sort of inserted his relative in it, and made it very Gothic, and put local, some local landmarks in, like Seaton Delaval.
I can just imagine someone going, "That's not true," and he's like, "Yeah, it happened to my uncle."
So he's definitely helping to make that story popular, and I think that's because of him. It's probably ended up in the table books in the Victorian period, because they're
they are such a high profile family, aren't they? That if they were telling the story,
yeah.
So
when I decided to have a look for the historical witch in Wallsend, naturally the first place I looked was Jo Bath's books,
of course,
because she's the go-to expert for the North East witches. And that's when I first got the name of Janet Pereson. She added her, I can't remember which one of her books it was, I think it was Charmers, an Enchanter's book. And Janet Pereson was a Wallsend woman accused of witchcraft, and the case is covered in the ecclesiastical court at Durham, and there's a copy of those depositions and proceedings in the Littonville in
Okay.
Newcastle. So I went along and had a look at the actual court case, the case as it was. And they were printed in the mid-19th century, but they did reproduce the 16th century vernacular, which I am just not even going to try, because I just, I looked at it and I thought, no, I'm going to just paraphrase all of that. So to give you the summary of the case of Janet Pereson, the case was heard about in 1570 in the ecclesiastical courts of Durham. The accusers were a 72-year-old farmer called Robert Durham of Wallsend, a 20-year-old woman called Catherine Fenwick, and the vicar of Benton. And Benton's a village very close to Wallsend, so maybe a mile or two away. So Robert accused Janet of being guilty of using witchcraft by using the measuring of belts to preserve folks from the fairy. So I will go into what that is a little bit later,
Right?
Because it's strange. It's not something people have commonly heard of today.
No.
So Catherine accused Janet of taking payment for using magical charms to cure a little boy by the name of Benjamin Witherington. And one of the allegations described the kind of cure she was offering to people. So she was asked to cure a boy who was taken by the fairy, and she instructed the mother to send 2 people to collect some south-running water. They had to remain silent when they did it. Then they had to wash the child in the water, dip his shirt in it, then hang the shirt on a hedge overnight. And the theory was that if the shirt was gone in the morning, then the boy would be cured. The accusers sort of ended their little testimony by saying, and the shirt was still there. So it didn't work. And that makes you wonder if it's somebody who's not happy. They've paid for a cure and it hasn't worked. So they're just, making a complaint about it. And the final allegation was from Robert Thompson, the vicar of Benton, and he really just reported hearsay that he'd heard that Janet was taking payments from numerous people for healing those that were taken by the fairy. So I know Tabitha probably covered the magical world and fairy lore in that episode, but it's just that at that time many people did strongly believe that fairies could harm you in your daily life, and that a person could be blighted by the fairies, and if they were, then they would most likely visit a cunning man or woman for a cure. And one of the treatments was measuring, and the afflicted person would be measured with a belt, and if there was a difference in the length of the belt when they were measured the second time, that could indicate there was like a fairy presence. And then the cunning person would sort of try and sell them some charms or talismans to banish the fairies and cure them of their ailment. So based on all of that, those list of accusations against Janet, a lot of what she's doing seems to be quite in line with what cunning folk practice.
Very like normal.
Nice stuff. It's like helpful. None of the allegations are like saying, oh, you've killed a cow or you've soured the milk. It's all sort of helpful. I think the main objection is that what she was doing was seen as immoral, that it wasn't, in line with what the church wanted her to do. But and in the 16th century, when the case occurred, there were some attempts to suppress cunning folk, especially in the later 16th century. But most of the time, if they weren't causing any trouble, they could just fly under the radar. And that makes you wonder, why did Janet's practices suddenly get pulled up to the fore? Why was her harmless and helpful actions appearing in a court case? And there's a couple of reasons for that, because alongside the allegations against Janet, her husband and son were charged with stealing a horse from the vicar, who also was one of the accusers, and the horse later turned up. But as well as that, and perhaps more importantly, in the footnote of the depositions, the printed copy, it notes that the witchcraft allegation against Janet is part of a series of exceptions against the witnesses in a tithe suite relative to the living of Benton. So tithe suites were really common at the time, and it's to do with payment of church dues. So the allegation, the tithe suite case was connected to the mother of one of the other accusers. So I think it was Catherine Fenwick. Her mother, Constance Fenwick, was the mother of one of the accusers who said that Janet was a witch, and she was highly involved in this tithe dispute. So there's an undercurrent. There's like the family.
So they were already in court fighting for something else,
and all these other things come up. Yeah, and I think they've had this dispute about payment of church dues, And it's all connected with Benton. So you've got the vicar of Benton always, he's lost a horse, but the horse turned up again. And then he's probably aware of what Janet's doing. And then he's decided, I'll just mention that here because it shows this family's quite disruptive. They're not paying their church dues. They're stealing horses. They're doing all this, cunning magic, like folk magic. So I think all of that's tied in. And I think it's probably a case of the family have been well known in the area, clearly lots of people had gone to Janet to get cures.
Yeah.
And it's only because of this bigger picture that's come up as a problem.
Yeah.
And does she go to jail, or is she hung, or is she actually burnt?
Nobody knows, which is the sad mystery of it. It's not recorded in the copy of the depositions and the exceptions. It's unlikely she would be burnt at the stake. That was more like across the border in Scotland.
Yeah.
That was likely to be an outcome. I wouldn't have thought she would have been hanged. I mean, it was an ecclesiastical court that tried if they took it to that far, they might more likely to have just given her a penance. She might have gone to prison at a push. Ecclesiastical courts still did look at sort of witchcraft and cunning folk.
Right.
But
okay.
often they had less severe penalties, I think. I know that a lot of it was penance if it was something that you were just being a bit disruptive.
Yeah.
So I don't think she would have been executed or hanged, and certainly not burnt at the stake.
Except in the legend.
In the legend, yes. Yeah. So I think as well, going back to the legend, in the court case, there's the use of running water against the fairy, and that is an element that crops up in the folktale, because running water is what's used to break the witch's spell on the flying plates. So it's definitely like a common kind of fairy lore in the area, that it would have been known running water would be able to break a spell.
Yeah.
So I think that's one element that does come from that. But I do think that probably what happened with this is that this was a real person, this was a real case. People would have known about the story, and then in the following years, as perhaps the memory of that story faded, there were a number of like really prominent witch trials. So you have 1590, the North Berwick Witches, north of the border. So you've got about 60 people being accused of using witchcraft to try and kill the king, James VI of Scotland.
Yeah.
And he was sailing back with his new wife, Anne of Denmark, and his boat hit a storm, and it was really, considered to be witchcraft trying to kill the king. And one of the accused women in that set of trials, Agnes Sampson, was tortured into confessing that she'd sailed out to sea on a sieve, tied parts of a dead man to a cat that she then cast into the sea in order to sink the ship. So there's a bit of a similarity here with the Wallsend Witches in that it's like utensils being used as transport. So, that plates, sieves.
Yeah. It's really fascinating to see like how an actual, like you say, like a person that actually lived and existed in this community. And I think maybe for our like innate desire to sensationalize or to tell a good story, we've people have embellished it and sort of removed the humane or the humanity like element from it, and it's like now this figure that could fly and was burnt at the stake. They're clearly like borrowing things from other witch trials, like because they're in Northumberland, so they're closer to Scotland. Yeah, and just like embellishing this tale to make it really sensationalized.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that they've also got the Newcastle Witch Trials in the 1649, 1650. Yeah. So that's really close to home. That's like 5 miles away from Wallsend. So this idea of witches and witch trials and fear of witchcraft, it's got to be seeping in the culture. It's there. Everybody's aware of it.
And what year was this going on with Janet again?
1570 or thereabouts.
Yeah.
So you've got that whole period where there's a lot of active, like sort of seeking witches. You've got King James, who became James I of England, writing demonology and being very anti-witchcraft and encouraging people to seek out witches.
Yeah, he was very obsessed with witches, wasn't he?
Yeah.
So Janet's case would have came before.
Yes.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah, and just sort of 1517, they've got 1590 for the North Berwick Witches, and James as he was James VI of Scotland, interrogated some of the witches personally. So I wonder if that's also an element of Delaval putting his ancestor in front and centre instead of the king being the one involved in the witchcraft.
Yeah,
resolving witchcraft. But so that's the I guess sort of the historical element. There's different things happening in the real world that could have been added into that tale. And I do think that you've got that real witch, as you say, she's engaging in magical practices. Later witch trials have been added in. And I think it's in no way provable, but I do think Janet's probably at some way the seed of the tale, that there's a memory of a real witch case in the local area, and that you get people like Francis Blake Delaval, who's just adding his own twist, embellishing it all, making it into a big gothic story for his friends, and then it ends up in a table book. And now it's almost forgotten. It's, in the 20th century, like I say, when I was growing up, it was a few people had heard of the Wallsend Witch or witches, but didn't really know anything more than that. Now, like when you Google it, there's a few people writing about it, and there's a few vloggers telling the story. So there's hope it might last into the digital age. But yeah, I think it's fascinating, and Wallsend is not somewhere you associate with witches and folk tales and dark doings in creepy old ruins. And so I like it from that for that perspective, but also that some of the places you can go and visit. So Holy Cross Church is still open to the public. It's a ruin.
I mean, because everything is very much like, by the time that was written, all those things are well established within the imagery of the Gothic witch story.
Yes, very stereotypical, almost tropes of the genre, isn't it? And and I think Victorians as well like a good creepy tale that's
they loved it
from the dim and distant, and they can just add a little bit of that's what they thought back then to it, because there is an opening paragraph in Richardson which is a little bit, was quite interesting, because it does talk about how even in the 1840s when they're writing it, there are still people in rural areas who do follow these practices against the fairy, but that it's preferable to think of these things as happening a long time ago in less enlightened times. But yeah, and I think one of the things the Victorians did as well was they collected so many of these oral traditions and folk tales, and then somehow that set them in stone, and a lot of them, well, I guess they were at a time when people were moving into industrial towns and not telling the tales as much. But it is funny that as soon as they got published, it's like everyone forgot the tale.
Yeah.
It just seems to be like the 20th century, nobody was really talking about it or remembered it that much, other than just that nice alliterative Wallsend Witches phrase.
Yeah.
Where is the Holy Cross Church then?
It's if it depends if you know Wallsend. So there's whole grounds. I think I wrote some directions. Yeah. So you can approach it. There's a housing estate just off the coast road where you can go in a nice sort of straightforward way. But the best way is through Old Hall Grounds Park. So it's all nice trees. You follow the river through the park. You go to there's a burn opens out from the park, so you follow along the burn, and then there's like old trees and a scrubby hill with some little narrow steps that you can go up, and it's very atmospheric. So you kind of creep up these steps, and then there's a sort of hill, and the church is at the top of the hill, and that's the nicest way to do it. And definitely imagine doing that on a dark night. And I mean, the Agnes Sampson said she'd attached parts of corpses to a cat, so to then try and kill the king. It's a lovely graveyard. I mean, they have lots of 18. I think they might even have some 17th century stones there, which are quite unusual. But lots of 18th century stones, very worn now, and they've got all of the, as I am now, so you shall be.
Yeah.
Creepy epithets on them. But yeah, I don't think in the past they buried bodies as deep as they do now, so there probably would be bits poking up every now and then.
Oh, wonderful.
It's easy.
It's strange how like our desire to have like logic in everything is sort of ruining the poetry of the Wallsend Witches
of this lovely tale.
Yeah. But yeah, and I think the obsession with the breast definitely comes from the Victorians.
Yeah.
The Victorians writing it, that was probably as saucy as they could get.
And then the other strange part of the tale is obviously the fact that apparently this accused witch was burnt at the stake in Northumberland.
Yeah, and that's like, there's no evidence, there's nothing in the records to say that anybody accused of witchcraft was burned on the beaches in Northumberland. That because there's somebody, I think there's a guy called Alan Fryer who'd looked into that side of it, and he couldn't find anything. And I just think, short of it being mob rule, you never know what went on under the radar of society and the law, but I don't think I think that's purely imported from across the border. And I think as well, because if that was added in later, say in the 18th century, if that element came in later, then that's also when that's a bit more separated from knowing that witches were routinely hanged in England. So, but yeah, I think as well, because Newcastle and Wallsend are access to shipping, you know, coal trade up and down. It probably wasn't that far up to North Berwick by boat. Tales would have passed along, and coal trade up and down the country. So I'm sure the stories would have passed by, and especially because the North Berwick Witches was like a treason trial, basically.
Yeah.
You know, trying to kill the king. So that everyone would have. I'm pretty sure everybody must have heard about that. And obviously the Newcastle Witches just down the road, the witch trials. So yeah, I think there's been enough of talk about witches and real events happening for it to just stick to the tale of that real, as people who died off who knew the real Janet Pereson and her family. I'm pretty sure that the idea that was a real witch in Wallsend was just too good to miss, to just add all of these extra accretions to the tale.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. I've been trying to reach, obviously, like, I'm sorry to do this to people, I've been trying to reach for like the logical bridge as to what plates could have maybe been mistaken for, and I don't know.
I don't
think they were just plates.
I feel like this entire thing probably is made up. So if you're making it up, why not fly away on plates?
Yeah, it's unexpected.
Yeah, that's for sure. Or if it was like an actual case where somebody managed to break free of the pyre and rush off and looked like they were running on something.
I think she was up in the sky on
No,
a plate.
she was
totally
up in the
true,
sky. On a plate.
Two plates.
2 plates,
I
Maria.
worry-
A
I
plate
worry
for each foot.
I worry about the second plate. I'm like, how did she synchronize them? Because it could have been really bad.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah,
it didn't
we've all
end
been
well
there.
anyway.
Yeah,
but
with roller skates.
You've got to have them going at the same speed. You've got to,
Yeah.
There's a lot of logistical worries about 2 plates. But yeah, I think it's I think it's part of the folklore. She'd had 2 new plates, and she put a little spell on them and flew away, but the person who brought them over had dipped them in running water. And from the Janet Pereson tale, running water is good proof against the fairies and against, you can break spells with it.
But the story of Janet is true.
Janet is definitely true.
We just don't know what actually happened to her.
No. And I think because it was brought up as an addition to the main case, that maybe she just got, I like to think she just got some penance and told, don't do that again. Or yeah, I think they were out to get the family, but it might just be because the family were kind of awkward and annoying lots of people. But the records, the trial book that I was looking at, the depositions, there was a case in about 1586 of another person with another Janet Pereson, but spelt slightly differently, in Dunstan, which is, again, it's sort of on the Gateshead side, a few miles away. And there's nothing to say it was her, but it's kind of a nice thought that maybe she did get away. But then she was also in the court records again. So I like to think she did get away, and that maybe she made a life somewhere else that was away from litigious neighbours.
Yeah.
Good on you, Janet. Good on you.
Yeah.
That's the tale of the Wallsend Witches and of Janet.
It certainly is.
I like to think Janet got away, especially if there's no kind of record of her kind of execution. I like to think she just kind of was like, this is getting a bit awkward. I'm going to do the thing, and then I'm going to go over there.
Yeah.
Hopefully she just went off to Gateshead.
Yeah.
Good on you, Janet. Good on you.
Yeah.
Because she seemed like, she was doing things to help people. She wasn't being
She seemed like she had trade.
Yeah.
From what you've told us.
Absolutely.
She had work. She could just go elsewhere with the work.
Yeah.
So
fingers crossed for Janet.
Yeah, let's hope this is a case of that. She did get away and this was just a kind of embellished story.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Very theatrical people decided they were going to add.
Thank you for letting me talk about the Wallsend Witches.
Thank you for coming on.
Thank you
Yeah.
for coming. You have to come back and regale us with more tales.
Yes, thank you for joining us for our special Halloween episode. We decided for Halloween to kind of, obviously the podcast is quite serious. We decided to tell a story that was kind of important to the area, but also that we kind of know was more or less fiction and something that was just kind of fun for Halloween rather than something incredibly serious. So we hoped you enjoyed this small break and this tale of the Wallsend Witches. Thank you for joining us, Sylvia.
Thank you for inviting me.
And we'll see you all in the next episode.
Bye-bye.